A woman cowers in her cellar as shells fly overhead on a hill just like this in the town of West-Ruspeke. The war had come to Belgium, to West-Ruspeke. The French soldiers begin to retreat from their position, leaving behind their most wounded and dying of men. The Germans will be here soon. They've entered the village. The woman, a trainee nurse named Marthe Cnockaert, hesitantly climbs up the steps of the cellar. She sees a French man dying in the corner of the room, pleading for water. Marthe knows that giving him water will only prolong his pain and suffering. At that moment, voices could be heard outside. German voices. A German Gefreiter burst in through the door. It was here in 1914 that the German army marched their troops into West-Ruspeke, a place that they would occupy for the next 4 years. Marthe would be stuck with her occupiers. In this video, we'll explore the stories of spies through first-hand accounts, visit the actual locations where they lived, and map out their journeys as we explore everything from recruitment to getting caught, as we find out how dangerous was it to be a spy in World War I. But Marthe's story is not unique. Indeed, thousands of Belgians went from living on a quiet countryside life to suddenly living a stone's throw away from the front lines. It's within this context that many turned to subterfuge, espionage, spying for their country against their oppressors. As Marthe had trained as a nurse, she offered her services up to the German army to treat wounded soldiers coming back from the front. And it was there that she became a very useful asset to the German army, which she could later use to gather information. But it soon became too dangerous here in West-Ruspeke with shelling, and by 1915, Marthe had to move further back behind the line to the town of Roulers, about 6 miles from the front lines. It was here that one night Marthe was talking with her mother, when slowly the door started creeping open. The pair looked at each other, and then back at the door, their eyes wide with panic. Who would be creeping in the middle of the night? It was then that a middle-aged woman appeared. Marthe and her mother could breathe a sigh of relief, for it was their family friend, Lucelle Deldonck. She had been missing since the German army had invaded West-Ruspeke, but now here she was, materialised in front of them. Lucelle explained to them that she'd been past the frontier, into the Netherlands, and she'd been working for the British as an intelligence agent. After some brief pleasantries, she carried on to say that she'd been working in Roulers. It was soon time for Lucelle to leave, for fear of being caught by the German military police. Marthe records in her own words what happened next. At the door, she, Lucelle, paused as if a thought struck her, and looked hard at me. "Marthe," she said slowly, "you are young and strong. Would you like to serve your country?" I knew just what she must mean, a spy. And for a moment I was filled with horror. I knew that spies existed in Belgium, and yet, somehow, I regarded them as things inhuman and far removed from my own sphere. Marthe had been approached, and yet her initial reluctance shows a wider disdain for spies during this time. They were regarded as almost a criminal race. Spies, after all, were deceitful, moved in the shadows, and caused unrest. Indeed, in every single one of the major powers of the First World War, there was a huge fear of espionage. In parts, this was brought on by their own governments in order to strengthen resolve against the enemy. In Germany, it got so bad that the Kölnische Volkszeitung actually stated that the population had reached a great, nearly frantic agitation. There were so many reports of the enemy in some locales, that it was almost seen as more of a hindrance than a help to the war effort. So how did Marthe choose to respond to Lucelle? Well, she replied, "I'm waiting for my instructions, Lucelle." So Marthe was willing to risk her life. Perhaps because she wanted her home back, wanted to be free of her oppressors, or she felt like she could be an asset. Marthe was in a unique position because she was trusted by the Germans. She was also in close proximity to soldiers coming back from the front. This meant that she could learn key information such as troop movements, locations of ammunition dumps, and more importantly, any big pushes that were planned. It's true that not everyone was approached in the middle of the night by a family friend to recruit them into the war effort. So let's explore some of the other ways in which people were recruited into the world of espionage and spying. The Nachrichtenabteilung was the Germans' naval intelligence department, and much like its army's counterpart, it struggled with its recruitment process. Importantly, the intelligence units of Germany needed people that could speak the languages of their enemies. On the Western Front, this meant either English or French. Naval intelligence used steamship companies, notably the Hamburg America Line or Hapag. These shipping employees would be useful for their maritime knowledge, plus because of their understanding of the places and the cultures that they travel to. Hapag meant agents that could speak English. The Nachrichten Abteilung approached one such man, Hans Lody. He had served in the Imperial German Navy under Arthur Tapkin, the first director of naval intelligence for Germany. Lody was familiar with English, having lived and worked in America. Fritz Praeger, the director of naval intelligence, approached Lody on the 8th of May 1914 to become an intelligence agent. Having been honoured to be chosen, Lody was sent to France until the outbreak of war. At that point, he was recalled and sent to Edinburgh in the UK. From Edinburgh, he was to monitor warships along the Scottish coast. He was to find out about losses and damage in the most unobstructive way possible. Unfortunately for Lody, he received no formal training in espionage, he learned no code, and his communications were intercepted by the British almost immediately. This led to his arrest and eventual execution. One of the primary locations for espionage recruitment in the First World War was actually the Netherlands. As a neutral country, its citizens could be afforded more freedoms in terms of travel between belligerents. It was well situated between Great Britain, Germany, and occupied Belgium. It became the go-to location for recruitment for both sides of the conflict. Hilmar Dirks was a spy handler for Germany's Nachrichten Abteilung. Dirks was based in the Dutch port city of Rotterdam and frequently recruited Dutch citizens for work in Great Britain. Dirks recruited men like Lody, sailors, those who could move freely about the UK and gain naval intelligence. However, much like with Lody, Heik Janssen and Wilhelm Roos, men recruited by Dirks, were both arrested and executed in the Tower of London. The men made no significant contribution to intelligence that could be reported back to Germany. Dirks himself was arrested by the Dutch police for his recruitment of Dutch citizens in 1915. The NAS sent espionage organisations that had slowly been building traction at the beginning of the 20th century were slow to get started. Indeed, their recruitment of people was often haphazard or based purely on happenstance. The Germans in particular had a very small pool of people on which to pull from. Indeed, because the need for intelligence agents was thrust upon them so suddenly in 1914, many were new to the art of espionage and had no experience, which resulted in mistakes. These mistakes led to the arrest and execution of many agents, such as Lody, who were easily caught thanks to counterintelligence networks that were set up. That's not to say that no training did exist. Indeed, training was conducted in Antwerp at a sort of spy school that was known as the Kriegsnachrichtenstelle, and that was run by Elsbeth Schragemuller from 1915. Elsbeth was known as the Fraulein Doktor, and by the end of the war, she held the rank of Oberleutnant, or First Lieutenant. And she'd been awarded the Iron Cross. Not much is known about the Kriegsnachrichtenstelle, but one could assume that they learned ciphers, how to decode messages, discretion, and methods of surveillance. At this point, Marthe had been recruited by the British to engage in espionage for them. She was given the codename of Laura and told how to convey her messages. She was to write down her reports and conceal them within her hair. At that point, she was immediately to convey her messages to another agent, nicknamed Number 63 in Roulez. She would not meet face to face with 63, but she would go down an alley, knock on a window. At that point, the window would open just a crack, a hand would come out, and Marthe would hand over her information. Marthe began to notice shipments of ammunition and supplies would come into Roulez via the train station. She tried to work out any patterns regarding the trains coming in, but couldn't quite work it out. So as Marthe would occasionally transport some patients back further behind the lines via the train station, she decided to seize her opportunity. So one day she had a couple hours before she had to be back at the hospital, so she decided to see if she could figure anything out. But she could hardly stay at the train station without causing too much suspicion. It was at that moment that one of the German officers that worked at the train station came up to her. To her surprise, the gentleman invited Marthe for some tea in his office. Marthe gladly accepted his invitation, realising it could be a time to find out some crucial information. They sat down and Marthe cast her eyes around the room, hoping that she might find some information that might suggest when the next train was due. The soldier was watching her. She had to be careful and so carried on with the pleasantries. Eventually the soldier suggested going for the day out in Ghent. Marthe seized her opportunity and asked when he was free. At that moment he went to his diary. Marthe looked over his shoulder and noticed that the next train was coming in at 3 AM on Wednesday. with heavy and light caliber shells and small arms ammunition. They agreed on their date for Friday, and Marthe left feeling a buzz of excitement. She hoped that she could get the Royal Flying Corps to bomb the train station when the train was there. And if all went to plan, she would not have to meet the slimy German officer, and hopefully he would be no more. She hurried back, and during the evening she passed on her information to 63. After a few nail-biting, nerve-wracking days, Marthe could breathe a sigh of relief. The British had come to Roulers in their planes, and after a short skirmish in the skies, they'd managed to bomb the ordnance train. Success. However, the 2 British pilots who carried out the raid were shot down and died not long after. A frightful reminder of how dangerous it was to fly in the First World War. So Marthe's first mission had been a success. It proved that her information was going back to the British, and more critically, the British were willing to act upon the information. But how else did spies collect information? Let's turn to one of Germany's most successful spies of the entire First World War, Jules Crawford Silber. Silber, a German by birth, managed to infiltrate his way into British intelligence. But how did he do this? After all, Germans were banned from entering the country after the outbreak of war. But Silber only entered the country in September 1914, after the outbreak of hostilities. To understand, we need to take it back a few steps. Silber, whilst born in Germany, moved to South Africa as a teenager. It was here that he learned English, Afrikaans and Zulu. Due to his understanding of the languages, he was recruited by the British to serve as a translator during the Second Boer War. He also worked in mail censorship for them. After his work in South Africa and a brief stint in India, Silber found himself in the USA. When war was declared between Britain and Germany in 1914, Silber was determined to get involved and help the Germans out. He decided to sail for London. However, because of the ban on Germans entering the country, Silber first travelled to Canada. As Canada at this point was still British, and due to being on the other side of the Atlantic, they were much more lenient about who they let into the country. Silber was still careful to conceal his German identity, and only showed his British documents that he obtained from his service to them. Having spent a brief period of time in Montreal, Silber finally set sail for the UK. He landed in Manchester, where he was extensively questioned for not having a passport. Eventually, he was granted entry into the UK. Silber next travelled to London, where he was interviewed by a British Army colonel for a position in the Mail Censorship Office. Silber and the colonel found common ground over their time in India, and Silber was offered the position of mail censor on October 12, 1914. This was a highly sensitive role that involved opening the post of frontline soldiers and removing sensitive information. Silber was therefore in a privileged position to see some very sensitive information. Whenever he saw something useful, Silber would use pre-stamped and pre-cleared envelopes and use microfilm and send the information back to Germany. His time in the Mail Censorship Office was highly productive, and after a string of promotions, he was soon made Chief Censor. This allowed Silber unrestricted access to the most highly sensitive of information. One of Silber's most notorious successes came when he passed on information regarding Britain's use of Q-ships. Q-ships were merchant vessels that were fitted with military-grade guns that were hidden. The idea was that the Q-ships would lure U-boats to the surface and then open fire on them. Q-boats sunk between 12 and 15 U-boats and damaged at least 60. They were responsible for over 10% of the U-boat sinkings. However, around half of these successes occurred between the months of June and September 1915. It's very likely that Silber's information regarding Q-ships reached Germany after this period, which stunted their effectiveness almost entirely. In 1917 alone, Q-boats sunk only 3 submarines. A crushing blow considering that normal naval vessels sunk around 28 U-boats. Silber was clearly an effective spy, as he was never uncovered as a mole, and he finally returned to Germany in 1925. So spies would be operating close to the front lines and far behind it, in great positions of power. But what about directly within the lines themselves? Well, we have a curious account that comes from Captain Horridge of the 5th Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers. And it goes like this. Then a most peculiar thing happened. A Scottish soldier emerged from some ruined dugout in no man's land, when the stretcher bearers were looking around for wounded, and someone brought him up to me. He was in the usual state, a bit worse for wear and his uniform thick with dried mud. There were no Scottish troops that day anywhere near us, so I questioned him. He said that he'd been there for many days, since a previous attack, that he'd been left in no man's land and then lost direction. and didn't know which way to go. He had been living on the iron rations found on dead men and the water from their water bottles. It seemed perfectly reasonable. So I simply told him to go off down the line. And then it struck me that, filthy though he was, the man was perfectly clean shaven. It wasn't the face of a man who'd been unable to wash or shave for the last 10 days. It was the face of a man who'd shaved that morning. In retrospect, and much too late, I realised that it could only mean one thing: a German who spoke English, wearing a uniform taken from a dead body who'd been lying out in a forward listening post, which had been overrun in the first attack. Whilst we'll never know if Captain Horridge was correct in his assumption about a German spy, it nevertheless highlights that it was a distinct possibility. With so many bodies strewn across no man's land, it would be perfectly possible for an enemy to recover a body and put on the uniform of an enemy. As we've learnt so far, many Germans learnt English and they could use that to their advantage. A man going across no man's land could easily learn of troop morale, pick up rumours about any upcoming attacks, understand the perception of their enemy, see the state of their supplies, and learn about the locations of their gun emplacements and artillery. This would have all been incredibly useful information. The way to get back across no man's land would be to clamber across and, with a predetermined method of re-entry, usually a password, you'd whisper that across and re-into your own trench you'd go. That was to say if you'd survived your interrogation and you weren't caught by the military police. So far we've looked at the brave men and women that operated as individuals or within small networks. But what about the larger groups of people, the networks of spies? The most well-known of spy networks that was developed in the First World War was known as La Dame Blanche, or the White Lady. It was founded in 1916 by Walter Dewey, a Belgian man who'd previously worked as an engineer in Brussels at the start of the war. The network expanded rapidly and they were very selective in who they picked to carry out their operations. Officially, La Dame Blanche operated with British General Headquarters until July 1917, when it was moved to be associated with the Tinsley organisation, which was based in the Netherlands with the British Secret Services. The Netherlands was a hub for espionage in World War I due to its neutral status. This allowed Britain to pay for operations and get orders across about the kinds of information that they wanted to receive. The British were primarily concerned with the operations regarding the railways. They wanted to know how many troops were coming to the front, the amount of ammunition, the weapons, and the frequency of those trains. This could give the British an accurate representation of the numbers of the enemy that they would be facing across the line from them. By the end of the war, the British would know the daily positions of the Germans, thanks to the work done by La Dame Blanche. Now, let's look at its makeup. By the end of the war, the network had 1,084 official members. No doubt others worked alongside official agents in providing information, much like with the French resistance in World War II. The network was primarily established in Belgium, but by 1918 there were agents across France and even Luxembourg to observe the Germans. Around 800 members were men, with over 300 agents being women. Churchmen made up about 8% of the organisation's numbers, probably because priests were less likely to be suspected of spying for the enemy. Throughout the organisation's operational years, there were only 10 instances of La Dame Blanche coming into contact with Germany's military judicial system. Of those interactions, only 45 agents were arrested, and somehow, almost unbelievably, only 2 were ever executed. The success of La Dame Blanche can probably be put down to the fact that individual agents would have probably known little outside of their own operational activities. Much like with Marthe, agents were localised and broken down into subdivisions. This meant that if one person was caught, they wouldn't be at risk of bringing down the entire network. So La Dame Blanche was never at high risk of being toppled. In fact, its operational power only went from strength to strength throughout the war. Indeed, by 1918, not a single German convoy could reach the front without La Dame Blanche reporting its existence. No doubt, the biggest success of the network came in March 1918, when agents noticed a rallying of troops and ammunition heading to the front. This warning gave the British several days' notice of what was to become the German Spring Offensive of 1918, a huge attack by the Germans that threatened to end the war, and they came mightily close to doing so. One might suggest that without the forewarning of La Dame Blanche, Germany might have actually prevailed and won the war. But as we know, that they were repelled, and eventually the Allies launched their 100 Days Offensive, which pushed the Germans all the way back and ended the war. Let's turn our attention back to Marthe, who'd been working hard to provide information to the British. She had successfully organised a bombing of a holding pen for new troops, managed to stand down a German spy in the British lines, You probably need to read her book to find out a bit more about that. Smuggled British prisoners of war to the frontier, and tried to warn the British about the first gas attacks. In the chaos, she'd even been awarded the Iron Cross for her services as a nurse to the German soldiers. By this point, Marthe had moved with her family into a cafe in Roulez. Many guests would pass through, including many German officers. It was one of these officers who came to board at the cafe that became of particular interest to Marthe. A man by the name of Otto von Prompt. He was more than likeable than most, and Marthe was happy to be in his company. However, it was one day that Marthe's friend Stefan came to her with a stark warning. The charming Otto that's been sent to live in your cafe as a decoy. Marthe quickly felt her lies unravelling. Was she caught? She couldn't be, surely. But if a counterintelligence officer was here in her cafe, it must be. Marthe continued to keep up her charade of being friendly to the young officer. For one time she saw a handsome man, now she could only see his sly look. He was cunning. One evening Otto approached Marthe, his eyes casting a furtive gaze around the room. "Fraulein, step aside a minute, will you please?" Marthe was certainly trembling by this point. Otto must have found something incriminating. Otto proceeded to ask Marthe to come up to his room, to speak more privately. "I want to speak to you on a very serious matter," he said. Marthe followed the man up to his room and took a seat. After a brief moment he said, "Perhaps you may be surprised to learn that I am a member of the German Secret Service. The question I have to ask you, Marthe, is this. Already you have gained the Iron Cross. Are you willing to work for the fatherland? To gain even greater distinction?" Marthe could hardly believe what she was hearing. Only a minute ago she believed she was about to be accused of being a spy. And here now was a German spy asking her to work for the Germans. She could hardly refuse the offer, that would be far too dangerous. She politely accepted. Otto explained that she would need to spy on her own people, find out who had been collaborating with the enemy. This really was rather a predicament for Marthe. She would have to provide the Germans enough information to have them believe that she was doing her job, but nothing that could be of actual use. For a week Marthe tried putting off giving any information to Otto, but at last she was forced into providing him with a report. Marthe had scribbled down some numbers in a random sequence on a bit of paper. She claimed that she had received the paper from an anonymous Belgian who had found it tied round the ankle of a carrier pigeon. Otto was certainly impressed. But this could not go on forever. Eventually Marthe told her friends Alphonse. 2 days later, the dead body of Otto von Prompt turned up along the Menin Road. Marthe had successfully evaded counterintelligence. For now. Counterintelligence for most of the major powers was fairly new on the outbreak of war. It was the outbreak of war that catalysed the expansion of the services. In Germany they'd established Abteilung 3B in 1899, but by 1914 the service was rapidly expanding and taking on new roles. For example, it went from intelligence gathering alone to interrogation of prisoners, postal censorship, intelligence gathering, and even propaganda. The organisation was headed up by Walter Nicolai, who was famous for having employed Mata Hari, perhaps the most famous spy to operate for the Germans during the First World War. The main operational area of Germany's Abteilung 3B was Belgium, an area rife with disaffected locals, and thus potentially enemy spies. The organisation was highly adept at arresting and interrogating people they believed to be spies. The most common sentences for those convicted was forced labour, in prisons such as Seeburg or Rheinbach. The German counterintelligence system's work resulted in the executions of 277 people, the majority of which being convicted of espionage. Of that number, 10 were women, although there was huge public backlash when the Germans executed the British nurse Edith Cavell, who helped prisoners to escape to the Netherlands. This likely resulted in the Germans being far more cautious with who they did execute, especially if they were women, only passing the most damning cases where the evidence was unrefutable, such as cases like Gabrielle Petit. Marthe was informed by Alphonse one day that she could be involved in a plot to blow up an ammunition dump in the middle of Roulez. Alphonse told her about an old sewer system underneath the town, which could be used to get past the guards. This sounded like an exciting opportunity. Marthe was in. Marthe and Alphonse managed to plant the explosives under the dump and retreated back along the tunnel to the hospital where they had entered. The dynamite went off and a huge explosion erupted throughout the town. It had been a great success. Marthe made her way back home without being caught. It was the next morning when Marthe made the discovery that her gold wristwatch was missing. She couldn't quite recall the last time she'd seen it, but thought it must have come off at the hospital. By the end of November, Marthe found a notice near the town commandant's office that listed a series of lost property, stolen by a soldier who had now been apprehended. Luckily for Marthe, her watch had been found. It was listed there with her initials, MC, on the inside. The next morning at 10 a.m, she went to the town commandant to collect her watch. The commandant handed her watch back, and after a brief bit of shopping she returned home. Later that day, an officer of the brigade staff and 2 soldiers with a Gefreiter was stood outside the cafe with fixed bayonets. They were ordered to make a search of the property. A short while later, behind her washstand, one of the soldiers found an encoded message. Marthe was arrested, accused of espionage. The lost property bulletin had been a ruse. The watch had actually been found by children playing near the rubble of the ammunition dump. The commandant believed that Marthe might have been implicated when they discovered the sewer entry point was near the hospital, combined with the initials MC on the watch. It only confirmed their suspicions when Marthe had turned up to collect her watch that day. The encoded message behind the nightstand was the nail in the coffin. All spies risked getting caught. In fact, most of the spies we know about today we only know about due to their military trials. Perhaps the most successful spies we'll never know about, in part thanks to their ability to remain anonymous. Marthe was caught due to her own mistakes, and most spies were caught in a similar fashion. Others confessed under interrogation to their own comrades. One such case is Louise de Bettingnes, also known as Alice Dubois. She operated incredibly throughout the First World War, setting up her own network of spies that would become known as the Alice Network. However, she most closely worked with another woman, known as Marie-Léonie Vanhoutte, also known as Charlotte Lamorin as her alias. The pair were incredibly successful in their operations, most notably with the organisation of the bombing of the Kaiser's Imperial train on its way to the front at Lille. That information led to 2 British bombers coming over and trying to bomb the train. Unfortunately, they did miss their target. The Alice Network also managed to transmit crucial information regarding a large German attack planned for Verdun in early 1916. However, the French dismissed this information, believing that such an attack would not come. As we know now, the Germans launched a large-scale invasion on Verdun in early February 1916, which Erich von Falkenhayn later claimed was meant to bleed France white. The Germans, seeing the success of the Alice Network, led German high command to wonder what was going on this so-called 40 kilometres of accursed front, out of a total of over 700 miles of front. The Abteilung 3B therefore worked overtime to try and bring the Alice Network to its knees. And they succeeded in their mission when they captured Marie Vanhoutte on the 24th of September 1915 in Brussels. Marie was forced to identify Louise, or Alice, from photos, which she did so. Louise was then arrested on the 20th of October 1915, when she was caught crossing the Franco-German border with forged papers returning from England. The Germans couldn't prove that Louise had been the head of the Alice Network, but all the same, come March 1916, she was sentenced to death for espionage. However, this was later commuted to life imprisonment. Louise would not survive the war and died in prison on September 27, 1918. Marie Vanhoutte survived the war and was freed from prison in 1918. A tragic story in which fellow spies could be forced into giving up their closest of friends on pain of interrogation. But it is thought that the work of the Alice Network likely saved upwards of 1,000 British lives by helping them cross the frontier into the Netherlands. On the 16th of March 1920, a tribute was posthumously awarded to Louise de Bettingnes in Lille, and she was awarded the Légion d'honneur, Croix de guerre avec palme, the British Military Medal, and an OBE. Marthe reached the doors of the prison, where Feldwebel Richter greeted her. Marthe walked into the dark, dank room. The cell door crashed closed behind her, and the hum of military boots faded away down the corridor. For 3 days, Marthe was greeted only by a mug of tea and a piece of black bread that was placed inside her cell. Finally, on the 4th day, a detective appeared. He greeted Marthe with the friendly, "You're going to die in a day or 2. Then proceeded to try and wrangle out a confession. Despite the detective's determination, Marthe held firm. The detective would crash into Marthe's cell upwards of 20 times a night, denying her sleep and hoping to force a confession. Marthe did not say a word. The minutes turned into days, the days turned into weeks, and Marthe was finally transferred to the military prison in Ghent, Her new cell was eerily clean, certainly nicer than the one in Roulers. 4 days into her time in Ghent, a lieutenant appeared with certain papers. He issued Marthe with her court-martial date. It was to be in a week's time. That was when her death sentence would surely be passed. The days passed by until a week had finally passed. The cell door swung open and an Unteroffizier was standing there with 2 privates. They marched Marthe up the stairs and into a hall. There were 9 men there, 8 officers and 1 president, all staring down, ready to pass their judgment. The charges were read aloud. Marthe refused to comment on her charges. However, she was allowed a defence in which the Oberarzt, the military doctor who had worked in Roulers with her, came to her defence of her character. After the defence, the president pronounced that a sentence would be passed in 4 days' time. Marthe was taken back to her cell in the preceding time. 4 days later, the president had this to say: "It is a terrible thing to condemn a fellow creature, especially when that creature is a woman. But you have been a cause of the deaths of many of my countrymen during your many months of your nefarious activities. The sentence is therefore that an hour and a place to be appointed later, you be taken out and shot to death." Marthe had been condemned. She would face the firing squad for her efforts to save her Belgium, her compatriots, her allies. However, this was not to be the end of Marthe's story, as there is one more twist in the tale. Shortly after her death sentence, a German priest came to see Marthe and say that her death sentence might be commuted. The next day she was marched back up to the courtroom to hear what was happening. It was there that she was told the Commander-in-Chief of areas under occupation had commuted her death sentence to life imprisonment for her contribution to Germans in the field. And of course the fact that she had been awarded the Iron Cross, Marthe had escaped death. She remained in prison until 1918. When the war was over, she was released. Her life as a spy, over. After the war, Marthe was awarded the French and Belgian Orders of the Legion of Honor. She wrote of her experiences in the war in a book named I Was a Spy, in which a majority of my information about her story comes from. No doubt there was certain embellishment in the story, but it was nevertheless a fantastic read. It gives the most detailed account that I have found of what it was actually like to be a spy during the First World War. And it's here that Marthe's story is concluded. I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for watching this video. If you did enjoy, please leave a like down below. Subscribe if you're new and let me know what topics you want to see me cover next. This is a brand new channel, so all the support that you can give me really does help. Thank you so much. I just want to thank Survive History for supporting the foundation of this channel. If you want to see some of the best quality history content on YouTube, make sure you go check them out. You won't be disappointed. They have everything from the Romans right the way through to World War II.